Everyone, I'm Nikki Gamble from Just Imagine, and today my author guest chat is JB Gill. Now, JB is going to be well known to most of our audience, either as a singer with JLS or more recently as co-presenter of Down on the Farm or Cooking with the Gills, or perhaps on Songs of Praise. But today we're going to be talking about an exciting new venture, the first book in a series. It's called Ace and the Animal Heroes. It's illustrated by Becca Moore and it's published by Puffin. And the first book is called Ace, the Big Farm Rescue. In this story, Ace lives with his grandparents, Gaga, his colourful, fun-loving granddad with the grapefruit-coloured shirt, and Gigi, his glamorous, inventor extraordinaire, culinary wizard grandmother. Life is pretty good. And then, unexpectedly, he inherits a farm from his great-uncle Hakeem with just 1 week to decide whether he will upturn his life and move to Kent. It's no spoiler to say that, of course, he does. So joining me today to tell us more about Ace and his farm is JB.
Hey, thanks, Nick. It's a wonderful introduction.
Thank you so much for joining me. I've been really excited about this. And can I tell you, I really enjoyed the story.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you. No, I'm glad. And like you say, I've been very much looking forward to speaking to you about it as well.
I mean, it feels like a very personal story, threaded throughout. There are all sorts of things that I can see connect to things that you feel very strongly about. And your hero, Ace, shares a name with your son as well. So perhaps we could start with that, your love affair with farming. Where did it all come from?
Well, I mean, I think actually began in my early years. I grew up in the countryside in the Caribbean, probably till I was about 3 or 4. And my dad always kept horses. So some of my earliest memories and certainly some of the photographs that my parents will have that I'll look back on have got, myself and my brother and my cousins all sat on the back of my dad's horses and, standing sort of, on sort of sugarcane plantations and things like that. And I have memories of my local friends within the village having donkeys and picking me up and my brother up and all that sort of stuff. So I think it probably started back then. That said, I did grow up in South London for most of my life, certainly most of my childhood. And so that proximity, that understanding of the farm wasn't, perhaps as highlighted then. But, my parents are both very keen advocates for the countryside. I remember we'd go on, sort of holiday trips to places like Kew Gardens and go and visit farms. And whenever family members came over from the Caribbean or from America, from the States, we'd always be doing some sort of sightseeing or visiting sort of local landmarks and monuments and things around the UK really that would be fun to do. I remember we going up to the Lake District, we did camping trips, we did all sorts of stuff. And so my understanding and my appreciation for the outdoors in particular and for the countryside was very much there, even though we lived in the city. And I suppose when I left my family home, I guess the farm kind of came into play purely because of where we were. We've got about 15 acres of farmland here. My mum encouraged me to purchase it alongside, my house purchase. And so for me, it was just a case of utilizing that space in the best way possible. And I knew that it had been farmed historically. I knew that the previous owners had kept horses and things like that. And so for me, it made sense to kind of keep the use of the farm within what it had historically been used for. And that's kind of how it began really. And over the years we've sort of built things up sort of step by step. We've added more animals and it hasn't quite gotten bigger, but yeah, it's still very much become more and more of an important part in our lifestyle. So yeah, that's kind of how it all came about.
Amazing. Can I just ask you, was it what you expected, or did you face any particular challenges, and how did you overcome them?
No, it's not what I expected. There are lots of challenges, and to be honest, you never overcome them because there's always challenges. Every single year there is a new challenge, whether it's the weather or whether it's, to do with the animals or whatever it might be. There's always something that you have to try and overcome. But, one of the things that I I was a little bit hesitant about, but actually found that was I had no reason to be worried. Was kind of the reception other people would have, and the thoughts that people would have around me being involved in it. And when you first start out, especially for me, I was very ambitious and didn't really think too much about sort of any negativity or anything like that. And thankfully, I've never ever experienced anybody or anything anywhere where it's been sort of negatively looked at. I've done lots of things over the years, and I've had support from people within the farming community, people within entertainment. Of course, things have developed since I first started, where you're seeing a lot more television programming based around farming and the outdoors and the countryside. And as I say, I've been supported by farmers within the industry, as well as people within entertainment who have no link to farming. So as I say, there are lots of challenges, but the support for me especially anyway, has been brilliant. And it's an industry that I love to be a part of.
Brilliant. Well, we're going to talk about the book mainly, and we're coming on to that. But one last general question, and that is, so we moved from farming into writing about it for children. Was that kind of sparked by having your own children, or had you always wanted to write a children's book?
Writing's always been one of my favourite things to do. Even when I was at school, my favourite subject, or one of my favourite subjects, was English. I loved essay writing. I loved reading. I've grown up with that love, since I can remember. And I've always been encouraged. My mum's a reader, especially, and she's always encouraged both myself and my sibling, my brother, to read and be avid readers. And that's something that's always stuck with me. And similarly, writing, I when I did my A levels, and even when I chose my university subject, I chose subjects that involved a lot of writing, and I don't think I would have been able to get through those had I not had a love of some sort for them. And for me, it was always about sort of getting across ideas, and what I love about it, especially with writing, is there's very few right and wrong. There are right and wrong, but there are a lot of grey areas, and you can kind of express yourself as something that can be taken in a completely different way, even though you're writing about the same subject, and have a completely different impact as well. And so, for me, being able to write about the farm, and to go from having a farm and then being able to translate that onto paper, whether it's obviously in this case for children, but for whatever audience, has been it's fantastic. And for me, it's a way for me to express myself, and it's, as I say, I absolutely thoroughly enjoy it.
It did come across as very personal, because I know of all your kind of personal interests and how they weave through, and also your love of language. Actually, I thought it was very readable, and I could sense a real delight in wordplay as well as I was reading. It's very lively read. So,
Yeah.
can I invite you to tell our listeners something about your wonderful cast of characters? Maybe we'll start with Ace and his grandparents.
Mm. And to just tell you about how I came up with them.
Mm.
Well, originally wasn't going to have the main character named after my son, Ace. I had another name for the main character, and I remember Ace was probably about 2, maybe. And we were talking about the book, and he was obviously very excited about it. And bearing in mind this particular edit of the book is probably about 8 years, in the making.
Wow.
Back then, this is almost 6 years ago, it was in a totally different format. So it was designed to be around his sort of readership, those early sort of children's book, picture books, that sort of thing. And as I say, I wasn't going to use his name, and he said to me, like, I said, quite vehemently, he's like, why can't I be the main character in the book? And I was just like, well, you can. Are you sure you want to be? And he said, yes, I definitely want to be. And, both my wife and I mentioned to him about sort of Christopher Robin with Winnie the Pooh. And, I'd read that he wasn't wasn't that keen on it, and wasn't very happy about it when he got older. And he, really affected him. And of course, I didn't want to have anything like that for my children, certainly not for my son, and so I had to be sure, and I had to make sure, I had to make sure he was sure, and he said, yeah, absolutely, I'd love to do it. So that kind of gave birth to Ace, and I wanted to come up with a different family base. Of course, well, certainly from my family, I've had a mother and a father. For my wife's family, same deal. She's had a mother and a father. But obviously, not everybody's family has that, has that shape and takes that form. So I wanted to come up with a different style of family that perhaps somebody who had experienced that would be able to identify with. And I decided, I ended up coming up with having his grandparents effectively as his parents. But also from different backgrounds, so not his maternal grandparents or paternal grandparents, but one of each. And it's almost like sort of a coming together of three different characters from almost three different places, but obviously linked through blood, kinda, and actually been seeing how they get on, and seeing how they develop, seeing how they help each other, seeing how they benefit each other. And that was really important to me, and it just made it a different sort of experience. I use names that I use in my family, and Ace uses for his grandparents, but they're loosely based. It's not our personal experience. It's just something that we wanted to kind of, I guess, have a bit of literary license with.
And as I said in the introduction, they are wonderful, colourful characters. One is incredibly sociable, talks to everybody, and the other is so glamorous, but she's a great cook in the kitchen and she's a great inventor as well. And it's fair to say, they feel quite ambivalent about leaving their city home to travel to the countryside. They know that it's going to be a big change. I used to work in schools in East London, and I remember taking children to city farms, and some of them had never been out of the city. And the reactions to that were very varied. Vividly recall some children just running and running and running in fields, so excited that they could do
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
And others being really scared because there were noises that they hadn't heard before. And these very different reactions to being in the countryside, and you allude to some of that. He wakes up and there's
Yeah.
a cockerel. What's that noise?
Yeah,
you know
yeah.
do you ever get children?
Absolutely.
Sorry, yes, no, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, for me, I think that's the beauty of the countryside, and vice versa, the city. For a lot of people who, live in the countryside and they go into a city, and they hear sirens and they hear horns and they hear, even those noises, of course, would be very unfamiliar to them. And I think, it's almost like learning about a new culture, I find. And being able to experience that and actually really become immersed in that on both sides, whether it's the city or the countryside, I think is something that sometimes gets lost in translation. And unless you actually get to experience it and spend time there, it's really difficult to sometimes to understand. And that's again what I wanted to put across in the book. There'll be lots of children who will either never get a chance to go to a city or vice versa, never get a chance to go to the countryside. But hopefully they'll be able to get a sense of both through reading the book. And for me, one of the things that I've sort of learned over the years is that, there seems to be sort of this, I don't know if I can still call it animosity, but sort of, I guess a case of, city and countryside don't mix. But actually, for me, I think they mix beautifully, and it's one of the things that I wanted to have as part of my family and part of my lifestyle. I am in sort of in the countryside now, semi-rural, but I do have decent access into London, and of course, I work in London quite a lot, and so my lifestyle is a bit of a hybrid when it comes to that. But I love it. I love being in town sometimes and going about and jumping on the tube and, all those sort of quick things that you can only really do when you're in a big city. And then similarly, I love being in the green fields and just going for a walk and, getting muddy and taking the kids and, lockdown for us was a brilliant time. We were able to actually spend time with each other, and when we did get a bit frustrated, we had that the benefit of lots of space. We could just kick out into the garden or even go for a long walk and not really have to to leave sort of our premises. And we were very lucky to be able to do that, of course, but that we valued that immensely. And so for me, being able to just give a little hint of that throughout the book, and for people to appreciate and to learn as well, not without sort of not intentionally forcing it down anybody's throats, but just giving a sense of what it might be like, or what it is like, in both environments was really important.
I think it would be lovely to hear a bit of the story now, actually. Would you read for us?
Absolutely, yeah. Let me see if I
Brilliant.
can find a good bit. Okay, so this is just a little snippet. Hold on. There we go. Yeah, it's a little snippet of when Ace leaves his home, leaves the city, and then goes to the countryside. And it starts at chapter 8. Friday's a good day to finish school on, thought Ace. They had fish and chips in the lunch hall, followed by double PE, and Mr. Telford even let them play football instead of doing exercises in the gym, because it was almost the weekend. Mrs. Dix threw a farewell party for Ace at the end of the day. She put music on, got the board games out, and dished out huge slices of homemade chocolate cake, although Samira did find a guinea pig hair in hers. While Ace was enjoying hairy chocolate cake at school, Gigi was starting to panic in the hallway at home, wondering how on earth she was going to get the house packed up in time. I'm going to have to use extreme measures, she thought to herself, heading down to the basement. Within 3 hours, Gigi managed to invent a new contraption called the Dynamic Packer, or Dynapacker for short. It was composed of mechanized bits and pieces, including a mini conveyor belt, with an entrance and an exit on either side. She placed an old box at the exit and one of Gaga's pink jumpers that had finished drying at its entrance. Then she stepped back to watch it work. The jumper was immaculately folded by the arms with hooks as it travelled through the body of the machine, landing in the box with a soft plop. Said Gigi, frowning at the 3 Dynapackers in front of her. You're going to have to go a lot faster than that. She cranked the speed up on each machine, leaving piles of clothes and shoes and books and household gadgets in front of them. She let them whir to life, packing everything neatly and efficiently. Time for a cup of tea, I think, said Gigi, heading up the basement stairs with a spring in her step. Chapter 9. More sausages, Ace? Mr. Jones roared, tipping another 5 sausages onto his plate, even though Ace was so full he thought he might explode. The Joneses had promised to send them off in style, and they had certainly done that, organising an epic barbecue where half the street had popped over to say her farewell, and sampled Gigi's world-famous spare ribs. It was a welcome break after a crazy Friday of non-stop packing and tidying and arranging. Thankfully, the Dynapackers had proven to be exceptionally efficient, so they had just about finished in time. Although there was quite a lot of cursing from Gaga when he realised he'd accidentally packed every single pair of underpants and couldn't remember which box they were in. Between everyone at the barbecue, there were more tears, mostly from Gigi, and laughter, mostly from Gaga, than one of those really mushy romantic comedies that your parents love watching and you hate sitting through. Tomorrow was the first day of a brand new adventure, but they were all going to miss their friends and neighbours. Saturday morning was bittersweet. Gigi treated everyone to scrambled eggs and honey on toast served on paper plates because the proper ones were packed away in one of the 100 boxes being lifted into the removal van. Gaga ran around the house flapping like a distressed flamingo, trying to make sure they had absolutely everything, while Gigi went to fire up the motorcycles. Ace heard Gaga bounding down the stairs and grabbed his rucksack. All clear, Ace, said Gaga. Time to say goodbye. The words seemed so final, but there was no backing out now. Kevin's mum had brought him over, as promised, as soon as his football training had finished to say goodbye, and as Ace walked out, he went straight over to hug his best friend. Gonna miss you, mate, Kevin said, kicking the ball against the wall while Gaga spoke to his mum, and Gigi waited for the removal people to secure all their belongings tightly in the van. I mean, who's going to give me those killer passes to set me up on goal? Ace laughed and joined in the ball kicking against the wall. You'll just have to go all the way yourself, he said. In any case, I'll come back in the holidays, or maybe you could come visit me for a few days if you don't have football camp. Ace knew he'd miss Kevin terribly, but he also knew he was one of those friends who was more like a brother. Even if they didn't see each other for ages, they would always be there for each other. Say cheese, said Mrs. Jones. She was standing next to her husband and smiling. Ace, Gigi, and Gaga huddled together and smiled back as Mrs. Jones took a picture of the 3 of them standing on the drive outside 11 Helix Gardens for the last time. Kevin passed Ace his helmet before doing a rainbow flip with the ball over his head. See you around, mate. One sidecar was full to the brim with all the odds and ends they couldn't fit into the house-moving van. The other sidecar's comfortable leather seat was waiting for Ace to assume his position. After one last look at their friends and the house he'd called home for just over 8 years, he gave a heavy sigh and slid on his helmet with an audible plunk. Then they were off. "Are we there yet?" Ace shouted over the rattling grumble of the traffic. The journey to First Fruits Farm was taking forever. They were heading to the quirky village of Bellevue in Kent. It was only about 55 miles outside London, but there were so many winding roads through the countryside that it was taking much longer than expected. Ace had no idea where they were, and they were starting to feel a little queasy, not to mention bored. He resigned himself to counting red trucks and only realised he dozed off when he was woken with a gentle poke in the shoulder by Gaga. "Wake up, Sleeping Beauty. We're here now," Gaga said, humming. The sky had darkened during the trip, and Ace rubbed the sleep out of his eyes before looking around him. He was surrounded by space and trees, and more space and more trees, and right in the middle of all that space and all those trees was the farmhouse. The long, snaking drive was bordered on both sides by a front garden bigger than the whole house in Helix Gardens. Ace's first thought was that Kevin would not be disappointed. He could build his own football pitch here 3 times over. He climbed out of the sidecar and took off his helmet. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for. He was nervous, but also excited. As he gazed up at the house, he couldn't help but notice that it looked older and more run down than he'd expected. And then he remembered that Great Uncle Hakeem hadn't been there for some time. Inside the house, everything was coated in inch-thick dust and smelled musty and damp, the kind of smell you get when you've had your sports kit wrapped up in your school bag for the whole of the summer holidays. He looked into the kitchen and could see 2 smashed windows next to the back door. The light bulb was missing, and the door itself looked like it might fall off its hinges at any time. Ace decided to explore upstairs. He couldn't help but notice how much the floorboards creaked and groaned beneath his feet. At the top of the stairs, he opened the first door on his right. "Ah!" Ace's scream was so loud it could have burst eardrums. His heart was beating like a hummingbird's wings. His face was full of terror, and he leaned against the wall to catch his breath before realizing it was covered in cobwebs. "Ah!" he shouted, flailing his arms around, trying to shake off the sticky threads of the webs. Something had flown at him from the corner of the room, and he soon worked out that the black shape flapping around his head was a bat. "Gaga!" Ace called frantically. Gaga bounded up the stairs to Ace's rescue, but they were so rickety that Gaga put his foot right through the top stair. "Ah! Gigi! Help!" screamed Gaga. "What on earth is going on up here?" Gigi said as she climbed the staircase, trying not to laugh at the spectacle that was before her. Ace was cowering on the only part of the landing that didn't have cobwebs on it, and Gaga, having freed his foot from the step, was now rolling around on the floor, groaning. "I think we might need to go to the hospital," he said. "I can't stand up." Oh dear, Gigi thought to herself. Oh dear indeed. They'd not even been in the house for 30 minutes and it was already a disaster. Gigi fired up Gaga's motorbike and, with Ace's help, managed to sit him on the back of it. To make matters worse, as she went to pull the front door of the farmhouse shut, the handle came off in her hand. She didn't dare tell the boys, in case they refused to return, and hoped that she'd be able to open it later on. When they eventually returned from the hospital and had a little something to eat, Gigi put one of the diner packers to good use. By bedtime, Ace was grateful he at least had somewhere comfy to sleep, but he couldn't help but feel deflated. Gaga and Gigi looked like he felt. They'd hardly said a word since they'd arrived back home, and after an unusually muted goodnight exchange between the 3 of them, Ace was too exhausted to do anything except brush his teeth and fall into bed.
So that gives us a really, really good flavour of what it's like. It's not going to be an idyllic farm that's all ready, set up for him to walk into. There are going to be a few problems along the way. Did you have lots of odd bits of equipment hanging around when you moved into your farm?
No, not quite in the same way. The previous owners that I bought the farm from, I mean, they were sort of retirement age, so they obviously, as you can imagine, very loving. I actually think they built our farmhouse, so there
Mm.
was so many memories that they'd built over the years and put into the house, and it just felt like the perfect place for us. It almost felt like a passing of the baton. Their family had already grown up and they were leaving and downsizing, and it was almost a case of we hadn't quite started our family yet, and we were just on that on that the
Oh,
beginning of that journey. So it was beautiful.
that's lovely. Now, all good stories have to have a bit of a problem in them. And this problem comes in the form of Councillor Crabbington. He's sort of your villain. You do build a nice backstory for him, but we won't go into that because people can discover that in the story. But
Yeah.
what is it that Councillor Crabbington wants?
Well, ultimately, I mean, it's one of those things. Ultimately, he wants revenge. He goes through an experience in his younger years that really impacts him and really affects him, and it's almost like he can't get out of that cycle of frustration and anger, and so he takes it out on anything he can possibly take it out on. And he's got a very powerful position within the village. The reason why I sort of involved that and I had him as sort of that main villain is because in villages and in small towns, most people have that relationship with each other where they know who the sort of main people in the village, the movers, the shakers. They know what's going on. They know whose children are there, and they have a really tight knit community usually. And I wanted to try and get that across. Of course, there's lots of history with Councillor Crabbington, and it's not always a positive history, but actually there are positive elements and positive aspects to him as well. And he comes across Ace and his grandparents and the farm squad, and he does feel threatened, but at the same time it's almost like he doesn't want them to succeed because that'll kind of take away his shine and take
Mm.
away his power. And so he's got this constant sort of power struggle that he's always going through. And of course, he kind of wants to do things all by himself, but he doesn't realize that there's just as much power as just as much power in working with other people, which obviously Ace and his grandparents, are able to unlock very easily, whereas he very much struggles with it.
Mm. And indeed, Ace's newfound friend Bear is obviously supporting him as well. So Councillor Crabbington has given them this task of taking this rundown farm basically and making it work, but they haven't got very long to do that in. Meanwhile, there is one more thing that we really must tell our listeners about, and that's the Wellingtons and what the Wellingtons do.
Yeah, absolutely. The yellow wellies were a nod to my favorite, well, my one of my favorite colors, but certainly my color within JLS. So I was the yellow member of JLS. Many of the readers might not know that, but yeah, that I wanted. It had to be yellow wellies, and my little boy, I think one of his first pair of wellies were yellow as well. So I had to kind of keep that thread going through there. And ultimately, what these wellies do, Ace stumbles across them, and he doesn't realize the impact that they have. And what it does is it allows him to have almost a deeper connection and deeper communication with the animals on the farm. And for him, that's invaluable because he's gone from a place of no real animal knowledge, no experience with animals, no understanding of what it's like to keep them and look after them, and then having to be brought quickly up to speed and then be able to look after their welfare and make sure that they're thriving and doing well in the absence of Great Uncle Hakeem, and obviously with all this stuff going on in the background, we're trying to get ready for the inspection that's coming in less than 30 days. So for him, it's almost like a way for him to get a head start, and for him to get caught up to speed. And it's tough, when you go into any new environment, it's very, very difficult for you to sort of get straight in there and just, fire all cylinders. But the wellies are almost one way for him to do that, to get a bit of a head start, and to one foot in the right direction of passing Councillor Crabbington's inspection.
So he's able to talk to the animals, and they all have their wonderful personalities, as you would expect in an animal story like this. We've got all the wonderful little piglets whose names begin with the letter D. We've got the
Yeah.
hens, Agatha, Pixie, and Floss, and Sybil the cow. And he gets to know them and their personalities. can you call them personalities with animals? Anyway, he gets to know their characters really well. Just as a slightly tricky question in a way, I know that you've never shied away from looking at how food is produced. And of course, Gigi makes the most delicious bacon pancakes, and yet we've got these little piglets running around the farm. Genuine question, how do you sort of reconcile those two things about food production and farming and a kind of proper image of farming and the talking animal thing? Just tell us a little bit about your thoughts on that.
Well, for sure. I mean, firstly, when Ace inherits this farm, of course he takes on various different animals, and I suppose that's very, very different to food production and a working farm. You know, there are two very different types, and you know, a lot of readers may well have experienced that if they've gone to sort of city farms, if they've gone to farm attractions and gone out for the day and you know been able to feed the goats and feed the, you know, whatever animals that might be on that farm. You know, that's one thing. But then, of course, we in this country and around the world, you know, we farm animals for food as well. And for me, I think there's a difference between the two of those. And regardless of whether animals are livestock or whether animals are, you know, there as pets, if you want to call them that. For me, you know, as human beings, we have a responsibility to be great stewards towards our animals, a responsibility to their welfare, a responsibility to, you know, how they're managed and how they're looked after and how they're cared for. And so for me, you know, being able to understand their characters, being able to understand, you know, the differences between species, the differences between even individual animals, you know, all the different piglets, for example, have different characteristics. So one's shy, one's the bossy one, you know, they all have different things. Even with the hens as well. Similarly, they are all chickens, but they all sort of have their own little parts of their character, which I think is the case with any, you know, with any animal. But at the same time, you know, I've never shied away, as you mentioned, that we produce, you know, you have animals that produce food for us. Even with my own children, you know, I've been very, very open and honest with them about where their food comes from. And I don't shy away from the fact that if people, you know, find that uncomfortable or perhaps don't even agree with it, then there's nothing wrong with having that opinion. But for me, you know, the story doesn't quite go as far as that. You know, this is very much about a new relationship, and Ace understanding how to look after and care for animals in this first instance, and that is the most important thing. And that's why, you know, even having the wellies and, you know, his ability to communicate, and you see the difference between that with him and Bear. Like, Bear has a great understanding of animals and has dealt with animals and obviously looked after them in the absence of great uncle Hakeem and Ace and Gaga and Gigi coming to the farm. But Ace is able to do more through the wellies, of course, than she's able to do, because she's just basing it on, you know, sort of blind, I guess, knowledge and just experience. And, you know, that's something that I find, you know, sometimes, you know, I even with my dog, you know, as sort of, I guess, the closest human relationship with an animal, there's times when I just think to myself, what on earth is she thinking when we do this or when we do that? You know, and so that's what I wanted to give to this story, just to have, you know, children and readers to be able to see, if a pig did talk, what would it say? If, you know, the chickens, you know, who always, when I see them on the farm, they run after each other and they peck each other and they fight each other for food and stuff like that. You know, what would that sound like and look like if you could actually hear what they were saying? And that's the beauty of it for me.
It is. It does develop empathy for the animals. You know, they ask for good food, nutritious food, and they ask for space, and they ask for sociability, and when they're allowed to kind of express their wants. One last question, because I know you've got a very busy day ahead of you, but one last question. I have to ask you this. Have you tried all of those combinations of pancakes that Gigi makes? Because I tell you what, I'm going to be trying them.
Not yet. I mean, I've definitely done obviously kiwi and lime. That was a really good one.
Right.
I haven't done the banana and grapefruit, but that's not too difficult a one to do. But my kids just love to have. They don't mind the banana pancakes, but my kids, like, as I touched on them, but they just love sort of lemon and sugar. And my son, actually, he likes what's he like, golden syrup, I think. So he just keeps it, yeah, very, very straightforward. They don't like too much change, But yeah, I'll definitely put it on my list to try out a few more different options.
I'm going to go experimenting. And in the meantime, best of luck with this new book. And we look forward to seeing what the next adventure brings as well. So thank you so much for talking to me today.
And thank you for having me, and obviously a huge thanks for your support as well.